I'm Craig Nash, Senior Editor at Good Faith Media.
And I'm Hayoung Park, a social work and theology student.
We are co-hosts of the Good Faith Bible Studies podcast, where we explore and discuss the weekly biblical text and lessons found in Good Faith magazine.
We'll also share ideas for leading group discussions on each week's text and lesson.
Let's dive in. We're going to read verses 1 through 5 and 15 through 16. In you, O Lord, I seek refuge. Do not let me ever be put to shame. In your righteousness, deliver me. Incline your ear to me. Rescue me speedily. Be a rock of refuge for me, a strong fortress to save me. You are indeed my rock and my fortress. For your name's sake, lead me and guide me. Take me out of the net that is hidden for me, for you are my refuge. Into your hand I commit my spirit. You have redeemed me, O Lord, faithful God. My times are in your hand. Deliver me from the hand of my enemies and persecutors. Let your face shine upon your servant. Save me in your steadfast love. So what are your initial thoughts on that, Hayoung?
Yeah. Well, Psalms are often very emotional and very internal. And I don't know, maybe it's just some things that I've been thinking about, being in social work world, or mental illness is something that we talk about pretty openly and often. There's some parts of this passage that really struck me as reflecting kind of the sentiments of paranoia or panic, and just someone being in this state of just even borderline clinical psychological stress.
Oh, yeah.
And specifically verse 4 says take me out of that net that is hidden for me. That's you're looking behind your back everywhere, and there's deliver me from the hand of my enemies. And so they're just this psalmist is seeing enemies and adversaries everywhere they go. So I think that just struck me as being really intense and echoing some experiences people might have had with mental illness.
Yeah, that's such a great reminder of how people of God have used the Psalms throughout the years. And, there's this idea of you're only supposed to think about what the original writer was feeling at the time, but that's not how Holy Scriptures work for most of us.
Right.
We've taken the Psalms and Proverbs and really all of Scriptures and internalized them for different areas of our lives when people are not chasing us, wanting our heads or not, in a battle situation. One thing we didn't mention as we were kind of talking through this is this, we're several weeks past Easter and Good Friday, but there's this passage in verse 5, into your hand I commit my spirit.
Right.
You have redeemed me, O Lord, faithful God. And speaking to that idea of how all of Scripture can be used for different things, Jesus used that passage while he was on the cross.
Right. There's that Christocentric interpretive lens, seeing I think it's Bonhoeffer that says something you can read all of the Psalms as if they were the words of Jesus.
Oh, wow.
And that's his interpretive frame, take it or leave it. But
that's great. I was also just immediately drawn to this initial line, not the opening line where the psalmist says, in you I take refuge, but the first kind of pure act of or pure question that the psalmist had is, let me never be put to shame. Not question, but request of God.
Yeah.
And I wonder why this is an initial thought to someone in despair. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but I just immediately thought that, hey, there's some difference here in the idea of shame for modern Western readers than there was for the original hearers. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Even contemporary Asian cultures have different understandings of shame.
Yeah. That struck me too, especially noting that it's the second phrase in the passage is I seek refuge, implying there's danger, right? Mm-hmm. And then the second thing is let me never be put to shame. And to me, that feels like you're in a life or death situation, and you're this is going to look really bad on my social media. That seems silly, but it probably means that there's some cultural, again, interpretive lens that I'm putting on that is anachronistic maybe to what this psalmist is trying to say. And even the study, which we'll unpack later, but talks about how shame can have different connotations, and certainly does in comparing our culture and the culture of the Bible. And so I think there's a lot to unpack with that particular emotion.
Hey, and then the last thing, I was just mindful throughout the psalm, unlike other psalms, I believe the one we read last week, but ones we've covered before. Unlike a lot of imprecatory psalms, there's not like a clear request, smite God's enemy. There's just a request for them to be put to shame.
Yeah.
So, and that's not to say there's not imprecatory psalms where those happen, but in this particular one,
Yeah.
we have an example of, and this speaks to your kind of thought about some of this mental despair. It's less about what happens out there, but what is happening internally.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it makes me wonder, like, what are the stakes of this shame?
Oh,
this
yeah, that's great.
psalmist is saying. It's certainly something different than what I might initially think.
Well, we will get into that more in just a moment when we talk about the lesson. Today's lesson, once again, was brought to us by our friend Sean Palmer. Sean is a pastor in the Houston area. What were some of your initial thoughts of his lesson?
Yeah. I mean, there's so much. And the way that this study reads, it's less of like a narrative arc where there's like a beginning, middle. It's more, it feels to me more like a commentary of like this verse, let's unpack it and the meaning, then moving on to this verse, which I think is in keeping with lots of Psalms. But one thing that stuck out to me is at one point, Sean says, the righteousness of God is often understood as severe and stern, but David understands it as protective. David is asking God to act in line with God's own character. And that was just surprising to me because, like, as the study acknowledges, like, I often think of God's righteousness as how God is separate and holy and this other, like, even like moral superior being. But here, righteousness is framed as the very reason why God is near, and what, like, to me, it immediately makes me think of like a mother that advocates for her children, and like, I think that reframe was just powerful, like, because God is consistent with the safety and love and care that God offers. That means that the righteousness of God protects us.
Yeah, that's great. It kind of is this idea that righteousness is not an adjective, or it doesn't like bring to mind adjectives. It is actually an action.
Right.
It takes work, this work of protection.
Right.
One of the things I appreciated, Sean recognized, similar to what I did, that the launching of the psalm is from a posture of dependence on God. And this is where he answers my question about shame, where he says there's a difference between how we perceive of shame and how ancient Near Eastern cultures would have understood it. So I appreciated that. And then, we've talked before about the difficulty of unpacking a psalm. And he wrote this towards the end that kind of in a subtle way gives voice to this. He wrote, for David, there are only two places anyone can be: in the hand of enemies or persecutors, or in the hands of God. This is where it's difficult to talk about Psalms, because once you kind of read them and internalize them, you realize that most of them are about one thing. There's a lot of different angles to that one thing, but it's kind of distilled into this, I don't want to say lesson,
Right.
but it is a lesson. And so that just gives voice to the challenges of studying Psalms, but also, ways that it helps stretch our brain.
Right. I do want to go back to that shame piece, actually. And, we were talking about different cultural interpretations. And one thing that comes to mind when I think about the different stakes that shame has in someone's life, it reminds me of, like, so I'm Korean. In Korean history, there's this just brutal kind of memory of Japanese colonization, of having like Korean language, our names, our practices, all these things like completely taken away when Japanese imperial forces came into Korea. And, there's like stories upon stories of people having to change their name and learning Japanese and things like that. So like that is one place where like that shame feels like survival.
Oh yeah.
And like I think for me, like I'm attaching that cultural memory to this psalm when I'm thinking about what shame
means. When you say survival, do you mean like when I hear that, I think of shame meaning erasure almost? Like God protecting us from shame is God retaining our identity in God.
Right.
Whereas, being shamed is, that's interesting. Shame does carry this connotation that I am no longer who I really am.
Yeah. And having that taken away from someone in such a violent way.
Yeah.
I think it, like, having someone's language taken away from you is a signal of a larger, like, just landscape of like
Yeah.
deep unsafety and violence.
Because it's not just your language, it's your stories, your
Right.
identity. It's everything about you.
Yeah, yeah. And it's also about the continuation of your family's identity, which
Okay,
is not
great.
nothing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. And it wouldn't have been nothing in David's time
Yeah.
either. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Well, in a few moments, we will discuss how small groups can approach this passage.
Before we discuss some ideas for leading a group through this week's text and lesson, we want you to know that we have created a leader's guide to help you prepare.
The Leader's Guide contains an overview of the lesson, some highlights to focus on, and several discussion questions for your group to go through.
For those questions, you can focus on one or all of them or any combination. Also, feel free to adapt them for your particular group's needs.
The Leader's Guide can be found at goodfaithmedia.org.
So when I'm thinking about what this passage, the psalm and the study look like in a Bible study setting, I think my first thought, kind of harkening back to my initial thought about like clinical psychosis and paranoia, is psalms can be taken in this direction of like this speaks to like a mental illness or like this deep internal agony, but also it might be something that someone takes in the direction of like, oh, this is like a historical event. Like, let's see what the psalmist was experiencing politically in that day. So like, you know, in a group setting, all of those different interpretive perspectives are there because each person is bringing that unique thing. And so for one person, we might be talking about this psalm and they might be like, this feels resonant with like the fight that I had with a friend recently,
Right.
which is valid, right? And also there might be someone that's like experiencing deep unsafety and distress, whether that be like a financial thing or a legal thing or whatever it may be. And that might feel like a characteristically different crisis. And we don't want to like play like who's suffering more. But when like lots of different people are coming to the same text and saying like, oh, I know what this means, there's room for conflict, misunderstanding. And so I think that might just be helpful for facilitators and leaders to be aware of with all psalms, but especially something like this.
Yeah, I think you've given voice to something too that speaks to the power. We talked when we opened this podcast many weeks ago about our first experience with scripture was through scripture memorization. And you've spoken a little bit to the power of that in that, you know, we memorize scripture during times when we have, you know, struggles with our friends or, you know, lunch table issues or whatever, and we can bring those psalms to mind. But it's only in doing that in those moments sometimes that we are able to do that in the like really deep, dark, traumatic times. I'm mindful of, I'm thinking of, do you watch The Pit?
Yes, I love that show.
So first season, I don't know if you remember Dr. Robbie, and for listeners, this isn't really a spoiler, kind of is, but you know, he grew up Jewish, and he remembers they were never really practicing Jews, but he remembers his grandmother praying the Shema, the Hear O Israel, the Lord your God is one, and he just internalized that, and he prayed it, and there was this in the first season, just this dark moment where he was in a room and he was like cowered in a corner praying the Shema. He was actually having a panic attack. And one of the doctors came in and heard him. And later the doctor asked, you know, what were you praying? And he explained it. And the other doctor said, I didn't know you were religious. And he said, well, I'm not. But sometimes I need to grab onto these things. So I was just, you know, thinking of that as you were talking. And then lastly, one thing a group could do, we've talked a little bit about Lectio Divina, which is just like, I think the literal translation is holy reading, which is just reading the passage slower and maybe reading it multiple times in a group, reading it once, letting moments of silence pass by, and then the leader asking the group to maybe share one word and then one word that stood out to them, and then do it again, and then say, what about a phrase? And then lastly, you know, what might God be trying to say to you during this time?
Yeah. And I think that practice is really helpful for poetic passages anywhere, but particularly like the Psalms, because sometimes you kind of have to turn off your intellectual brain to like really get what's going on.
That's such a great word.
Yeah, and like that slowing down and like meditative practice is really great for grounding that.
Yeah. I appreciate it. Sometimes you have to turn. What did you say? Turn
off your intellectual brain. I think.
yeah. That's great. I think it's like you have to turn off this impulse we have to analyze Scripture and let it work on us.
Yeah. Seminary has definitely been a test of that skill for sure.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, we look forward to discussing another psalm next week on Good Faith Bible Studies.
I'm Hayoung Park.
And I'm Craig Nash.
And you've been listening to the Good Faith Bible Studies podcast from Good Faith Media.
Our music comes from Pond 5.
Each weekly lesson can be found in Good Faith magazine.
You can also sign up to receive a free digital leader's guide.
Learn about how to receive both these resources at goodfaithmedia.org.
There you can find daily news and opinion, various podcasts from our Good Faith Media team and partners, and information about the initiatives that help guide our work.
So visit us at goodfaithmedia.org, and we'll be back next week with another installment of the Good Faith Bible Studies podcast.